Millions of Venezuelans are wondering what lies in store amid a duel for the presidency that has divided international support. I'm Femi Oke.
And I'm Malika Bilal. As an interim president maintains his push for power, we want to hear from you. Send your thoughts via Twitter and the YouTube live chat.
President Nicolas Maduro is facing an unprecedented challenge to his leadership by the head of the country's National Assembly. Juan Guaido declared himself interim president on Wednesday amid anti-government protests in the capital Caracas. US President Donald Trump supports Guaido, while Argentina, Brazil and Colombia are among those also backing him. But Maduro says Guaido's declaration is unconstitutional and he has the support of Russia, Turkey and China. Malika has more on what people are saying online. Malika?
Venezuela. Maduro es mi presidente. 27 January. Just some of the hashtags that Venezuelans on both sides of this issue have been rallying around in recent weeks. Supporters of President Maduro are using the hashtag Maduro is my president and we are Maduro. Astor Wango tweets, seeing who supports the self-proclaimed Guaido gives me more reasons to support Maduro. While Facebook user Kayla Pop used one of the hashtags to rally support for a pro-Maduro event held in New York City. Juan Guaido is calling for more protests, but there are concerns for the safety of demonstrators. Former stream guest and Caracas-based photojournalist Andrea Hernandez took these photos. She says 13 people were killed on the first day of demonstrations. The Venezuelan Observatory for Social Conflict is tweeting updates on the number of people who have died during protests so far. This tweet, using the hashtag for January 25th, reports 29 people dead. The group has also created a Google map to document those deaths. Foro Penal, which provides legal support to people in detention, is also documenting the treatment of protesters. Founder Gonzalo Hemiob tweeted Sunday that 791 protesters had been arrested since demonstrations began. Femi?
Thank you so much. So for more on this, we're joined in the studio by David Smolensky. He is a former mayor of the El Hatillo municipality of Caracas, and he's now living in exile and is a visiting scholar at Georgetown University. Tamara Adrian is a member of the Venezuelan National Assembly and also a member of the Popular Will Party that is part of the opposition to Nicolas Maduro. She is in Caracas. In Amherst, Massachusetts, we have Alejandro Velasco. He is a historian of modern Latin America, and he's extensively researched Venezuela. And from Philadelphia, we have George Chicarella Marr. He's an organizer, writer, and political theorist who has also written widely about Venezuela. It's good to have you here, everybody. Let me just try out your historian, flex your muscles here, Alejandro. How is it possible to have an interim president and a president of Venezuela at the same time?
Well, I mean, it's not possible. What Guaido has appealed to is a particular article in the Constitution, 233, which declares in the event of a vacuum of power in the executive, then the faculties of that office go down to the president of the National Assembly. And they declare that there's a vacuum of power in the executive because of the tremendous concerns about irregularities in the presidential elections of last year, which gave Maduro a fresh new 6-year term. He was supposed to swear himself in for a second 6-year term on January 10th, and so according to Article 233, Guaido suggests that it because his presidential mandate is illegitimate, that it falls upon him to be president.
All right. So the bit that I absolutely understood there from what you were saying, Alejandro, was this a vacuum of power. But is there a vacuum of power, David, as far as you're concerned?
Totally. There is a vacuum of power since January 10th. And that is why, according to our constitution, what is a vacuum of power, the Speaker of the House becomes the president, the interim president. And that's what Juan Guaido is doing. He's the interim president of Venezuela. He's the head of state. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's been recognized by more than 40 governments already, Colombia and Brazil, which are our neighbors, it's United States, Canada, but even Georgia, Kosovo, Germany, France are also recognizing Guaido as the interim president, Australia, Israel. So while we're the only piece of the puzzle that we're waiting is the majority of the armed forces to become loyal, to become institutional, and with that, the transition will formally begin in Venezuela. At this time, Maduro is completely isolated, and he's using the forces, and he's killing people, as we heard. Almost 30 people have been killed, and irregular groups to be in the palace.
I hear what you're saying there, David, but I want to bring this tweet up from Carlos.
Yes.
Carlos says that the legitimacy of Guaido is a tricky question in his view. He says the process he followed to claim the presidency is not strictly legal, but he is constitutionally allowed, as our guest said today, to claim the presidency if Congress deems the seat of the president is vacant or taken, claimed through fraud. So clearly this is something that is up to how you interpret the Constitution, and we've already seen several people interpreting it slightly differently tomorrow there. Can you talk to us about what this person views as a tricky question? What is it in your view?
This is, in my view, the problem it's to be understood from a larger perspective. This is started in 2015 when the National Assembly did the 2/3 of the supermajority of the National Assembly was won by the opposition, and then immediately after Maduro stopped to have a electoral system or create a fraudulent system, that it's impeding since then to have free and fair elections. And suddenly in 2018, after having declared illegal most of the important parties in Venezuela, including Acción Democrática, Voluntad Popular, Primero Justicia, Un Nuevo Tiempo, among others, he decided to using the National Assembly, Constitutional National Assembly, which is a parallel institution that is also a fraudulent institution, called for elections 9 months in advance, and these elections were not accepted by except a few countries, 13 or 14, if I recall well.
All right, so I want to play to you, George, and to our other guests, what the Venezuela defense minister is describing what is happening right now. He is saying that a coup is taking place. Let's have a listen in to what he had to say.
Alerto al pueblo de Venezuela que se está llevando un golpe de Estado contra la institucionalidad, contra nuestra democracia, contra nuestra constitución, contra el presidente Nicolás Maduro, presidente legítimo de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Un señor levantando la mano nuevamente, autoproclamándose presidente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Es un asunto gravísimo.
A very serious issue. That's to put it mildly. George, your take?
Sure. I mean, the only correction that I would offer is that this is not necessarily a coup, but it's an attempted coup, right? The military has not taken the side of these coup plotters, who are, you don't need to be a constitutional expert or a lawyer to understand what Article 233 says. It says absence of power. It says an absence of the president abandoning his post. It doesn't say anything about fraud. It doesn't say anything about anything else. These are all being read into a much longer historical process that is incredibly complicated, right? The opposition won the National Assembly in 2015. This is true, and it's a strange dictatorship that allows for the opposition to win elections. But instead of pursuing a program of reform or economic stabilization, the opposition decided to antagonize and attempt to remove the president and attempt to declare the Supreme Court in contempt. And as a result, was declared in contempt by the Supreme Court. And this is the tit for tat that's been playing out now for a couple of years. But there's one elected president of Venezuela, and there's an attempt using, as David has done explicitly, this sort of recognition by right-wing governments across Latin America, as though that were some measure of legitimacy, when that's not how you measure legitimacy in a democratic world.
David.
Well, I would like to explain a little bit more that since the opposition won the majority of the National Assembly, a lot of congressmen right now are in exile because they have been persecuted. 30 mayors were removed after we won our elections, and 6 of them went to jail. I am one of those 30 mayors. Also, a councilman was killed 4 months ago after he was detained because he participated on the General Assembly of the UN. And as we speak, more than 400 political there are 400 political prisoners in Venezuela. So we are facing a regime that is a human rights violator. It's a regime that is clearly involved in drug trafficking, illegal mining, that has become not only a threat to Venezuela, but a threat to the region. I have to say that Maduro is responsible of 3.3 millions of Venezuelans, migrants, and refugees that have left the country because of shortages of food, shortages of medicine, a hyperinflation of more than 1 million%. And since January 10th, there is a vacancy of power because we did not have free and fair elections anymore. So, as I said, I mean, the majority of the international community is recognizing the interim president, Juan Guaido. The majority of the Venezuelans, which is the most important thing here, are supporting Juan Guaido as the interim president. And Maduro is using an elite of armed forces, an irregular group, to stay at the palace. But as we speak, he's completely isolated.
I want to be clear. This talk of exile is very misleading. This mayor in exile talk. We're talking about people, including David, whose arrest was ordered for allowing and even encouraging bloody protest in the streets of their own municipalities. In other words, not protecting their own citizens. And this is why people were ordered arrested. And so we're talking about not exiles, we're talking about fugitives from justice. Also,
I think you justified a councilman because he participated in a General Assembly of the OEN. He was detained at the airport and then he was killed in a prison. So is that good for you? Well, you have a problem with human rights.
I hear the back and forth between you there and understand your points, George and David. I wanted to bring in this perspective, picking up on something that was said earlier about the shortages of food, because I want our audience to remember why it is that Venezuela is in the situation it is now. This is Laura Vidal. She says these protests are linked to the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro's election in 2018, which comes in the context of a deep crisis reaching many aspects of country life: lack of food and medicine, health crisis, urban violence, human rights violations. We also heard from someone else who's there, Andrea Hernandez, who you saw pictures from earlier in the show. She said it's been a couple of rough weeks in Venezuela. There are protests all over the country and they're being repressed. In Caracas, daily life is interrupted by the violent clashes between demonstrators and police, most of which occur in the barrios. So, Tamara, talk to us about what daily life is like for the average Venezuelan.
Well, actually, I will take the last sentence used by Andrea, in the sense that a huge change that have occurred in this year protest is that they are concentrated mainly in the very poor neighborhoods, where the police, the elite forces are now disappearing people, putting people in jail or killing. The number of killed people officially, it's now around 46 or 44. And the number of people put in prison, it's now around 970. So it's a situation that is not comparable to the situation of the former protests back in 2017, because probably many of the persons who were protesting in 2017 just fled the country because of the lack of opportunities and the lack of medicine and the lack of food. And but it happens also in the very poor neighborhoods. What is, I understand, new in this situation, it's the popular support.
Alejandra, I want to play you a couple of clips of protesters on the street. What caught my eye was how young they actually are. Have a look.
It is time to end this dictatorship. Please take to the streets. Enough with all this hunger, the shortages of medicine, and people dying in the street of hunger. Enough. People of Venezuela, please. It is time to take to the streets.
That is why we are here, to support our National Assembly, the only legitimate power for the 14 million Venezuelan, which is with its people today. And the Venezuelan people are here. The youth are calling on the entire military to listen to the people.
Alejandro, as far as you're concerned, who's driving the movement on the street? Is it coming from young people or is it coming from everybody?
It's cross-cutting for sure. I mean, as Tamara was mentioning, there's not just a generalized sense of discontent with the government, in part having to do with the hyperinflation that you're mentioning, the kinds of shortages that you're talking about, but also the inability to see itself out of this kind of economic stalemate that, as George was mentioning, is complex in terms of its causes. But what is significant to me is that unlike other protests in 2014 and 2017, 2019, yes, in fact, there are certainly youth that are at the forefront, but primarily what we're seeing, in part because of the significant amount of people who've left over the last 2.5 years, that it's less those sectors of the population, and it's really more older folks, not older, right? But those are the ones who've remained, right? I would like to make one particular point about the issue of popular support, which David is right in bringing up. But the fact is that we actually don't know if the majority of Venezuelans support Juan Guaido as president. That same article that is appealed to as a way to legitimize Juan Guaido's claim to the presidency also calls for elections to be held within 30 days. And although they have been, Guaido has said that that's part of the plan to call elections, we don't know when those would happen, right? So, in terms of thinking about the stability of Venezuela going forward, what needs to happen is the calling for elections as soon as possible.
So someone here who would agree with you, this is John on Twitter, who says, Maduro has an incentive to call for elections if he feels that his removal is imminent, probably via defection from the military high command, of which I am not convinced, or if he faces continued international opprobrium that gives governance unviable. George, I wanted to go to you with this one because he talks about something that we've seen hints of online, other people talking about where the military is in this. What's your take on that in this tweet?
I think the military is unlikely to move against the Venezuelan government, despite all of the pressures coming down on it. You've got, definitely generals and others. You see the military attaché in the United States who are clearly being offered all these incentives to break, to spend the rest of their lives living in the United States in comfortable circumstances if they're willing to make this political move to help to weaken the Maduro government. I think that's, unlikely. At the same time, this question of the elections is very difficult as well, because, for example, you've got European countries essentially threatening the Venezuelan government that they will recognize Guaido if Maduro doesn't call elections, and it looks incredibly, difficult, and it looks weak for a political leader who was just, of course, inaugurated for a second term to heed these calls, these threats, these ultimatums from foreign countries that should have really no say, zero say in what's going on in Venezuela.
Totally agree that we need to have free and fair elections. That's a commitment that the interim president, Juan Guaido, has. That's what our constitution says, and that's what the majority of the people, I could say not the majority, all Venezuelans in the international community also wants. And we have been asking for that for years, but unfortunately we have not had free and fair elections because the main leaders are in prison or in jail. Political parties, as every dictatorship does, are illegalized in Venezuela. There's no free media, and there's no neutral electoral council. So we want to change that under interim president Juan Guaido. We want to have free and fair elections that with legal political parties, that anyone who wants to run who could run with a free media, and lets the people choose the candidate they want.
When would that happen, David?
Well, it needs to happen as soon as possible, but to achieve that is very important that Maduro has to step down, and we all know that. I mean, has been protected now by an elite of the armed forces and by regular groups. And according to soldiers in Venezuela, there are more than 200 soldiers that are now in prison. So not only soldiers abroad are being outspoken against the regime, but also soldiers in Venezuela as well, because they're suffering from the same problems as any Venezuelan. They're suffering for hyperinflation, shortages of food, shortages of medicine, and even crime.
And yet we haven't seen, I'm sorry. And yet we haven't seen.
Go ahead, and then I'm going to come off the back of you because we're almost at the end of the show, but go ahead.
Yeah. And yet we haven't seen, as George is mentioning, a kind of broad-based, generalized defection, which I agree that wouldn't come from the higher ranks because they have too much invested in Maduro staying in power. It would come from the middle ranks. I think partly it has to do with some confusion regarding the proposed amnesty law that the National Assembly has used as a kind of carrot to entice some of these middle ranks to to switch allegiances. And the discussions now are suggesting that in fact the law that's been proposed is so ambiguous as to be unenforceable, right? So I guess one question would be asked of David and others, and Tamara for sure, what kinds of alterations, what kind of moves have been made to bring that amnesty law into international standards, and therefore what would be the likelihood of more significant defections coming forward?
Tamar, can you answer that very briefly so I can move on?
Well, Actually, I think this is the amnesty law and the current in the current statute, which is in the discussion for the second discussion, the public discussion, will give place for any other changes that are needed according to international standards, and particularly to avoid that those who are human rights violators or have violating human rights might be in the covered under this law.
Okay. All right. We've been talking about the international community right there. I want to show you what has been happening at the United Nations just this past weekend and the part that America and other nations are playing in it regarding what's happening in Venezuela. Have a look.
Now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games. Either you stand with the forces of freedom or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
Venezuela does not represent a threat to peace and security. If anything does represent a threat to peace, it is the shameless and aggressive action of the United States and their allies aimed at the ouster of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela.
The international community have very strong views on what it means for America and other nations to be involved in Venezuela, Malika.
One of them is Estela here, a Maduro supporter who writes in Spanish, and it's translated here below. We will not allow the vultures to go for the oil of Venezuela. And that is in reference to some of these international powers that people see as just trying to get their hands on Venezuela's oil. Estela says the majority of Venezuelans support Nicolas Maduro. But I wanted to share the opposite point of view from a video comment we got from a journalist in Caracas. Milanio sent us this.
One of the things that people outside Venezuela need to understand about what is happening here is that this movement is not a coup. It's a political movement that is written in our constitution. And it's not only the US that is backing up this new President Guaido. It's also many countries across America and even in Europe. And what we need to heal the people of Venezuela and our country, it's a new government and a democratic government that respects human rights.
So two different views there, David, on one looking at the international community as being greedy and meddling, and the other saying actually it's interesting that we're getting support from the US and Europe and other countries.
Yes, well, as I said before, I mean, this is something unique in the region. Not only the US is recognizing Juan Guaido as the interim president, the majority of Latin American countries, they voted, 19 countries in the Organization of American States voted in favor to recognize Guaido as the interim president. Also, Georgia, Kosovo, Australia, Israel, the European Union will do that in the next days. And the sooner in Venezuela we have democracy, the better for the region. And regarding the oil thing that the US is interested, I mean, all the oil that has given to Cuba for free, the gas fields that now Russia is running illegally because it was given with no approval of the National Assembly, those are the things that need to be renegotiated in Venezuela in the future. We want every nation to have the opportunity to invest in Venezuela, but we need to do this legally, not the way that has been given the last years.
I mean, it's actually not unprecedented. Historically speaking, in 1954, for instance, the OAS backed the ouster of democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, and we've seen sort of other kinds of interventions. So the issue of the U.S. Or other countries in Latin America recognizing interim presidents is not that big. That's not unique. I guess I would ask David, right? I mean, if partly the struggle
Alejandro,
is
I have a minute
democracy,
left. I have a minute left in this show. What's
but
your
I guess
question?
I would ask, what would he say to, what would he say of Elliot Abrams having been appointed as special envoy? No one would mistake Elliot Abrams as a supporter of democracy and human rights.
Alejandro, your question has ended. David, what is your answer?
That's a question that you can ask to the U.S. administration.
I'm asking it to you because you're the one who's been meeting with them.
I met with him, and our commitment is to have free and fair elections. Our commitment is to restore democracy in Venezuela. Our commitment is that our people stop suffering for shortages of food
And yet you
medicine.
celebrate the support of war
that's
criminals.
it.
You have war criminals on your side. That's
And,
something about
no,
supporting this coup.
we have the recognition of the majority of Latin American countries, and we have the recognition
Tamara,
of the European
Alejandro,
Union
David,
and other countries
George,
as well.
Just when it begins to get a little spiky is when we're going to wrap it up. But we will continue online. Can I also turn your attention to online here as well, aljazeera.com. Look for news, look for Latin America, the latest in Venezuela. We are updating it hour by hour. You can stay tuned right there. Thanks for watching this episode of The Street. See you online.